Adobe Digital Editions. Star Trek_Deep Space Nine. A Stitch in Time. Andrew J. Robinson. EPUB window. Focus on book content text. Not 8. I couldn't believe that was possible. I looked through an opening when I was certain it was safe. The last gray streaks of light were fading on the horizon. By the time I tucked Mila safely away, it was time to continue. I reoriented myself, chose the direction and set off. I was determined not to be captured, especially not by the gruff voice. It was a long, nerve-wracking night. The beams of night probes were constantly crisscrossing the darkness. We eluded 2 other groups, including the Tartle. I could hear our section leader, one Tartle, urging on the others with the same threats of punishment. Were there this many hunting groups the last time? And were they as advanced as the Tartle? Since I'd been captured so quickly I couldn't know. And I refused to allow these questions to interfere with the task at hand. I walked. I ran. I crawled. I curled up into a ball. I dug myself into the sand. I did whatever was necessary. On one occasion, passing hunters should have detected me. I was amazed when they passed within feet of my crouched and curled body. Perhaps they thought I was a rock. Mila's lessons were making the difference. Just before dawn I strolled up to the central gate. The 2 sentries were shocked and speechless. 10 Lubac returning from the field, I announced. The tall and graceful figure quickly emerged from the darkness behind the sentries and into the harsh floodlight. There's nothing to smile about, Merc. My blood froze. It was him. Unfortunately, my self-satisfied smile also froze. So much for my newly discovered power to adjust to changing circumstances. Pleased with yourself, aren't you? The gruff voice asked. Were you also pleased after your great victory in the storeroom corridor? Obviously he knew it had been Abe and me, and it wasn't a forgotten incident. I continued to smile. We'll see about that. And about your idiotic smile. Get back to your section! Yes. I didn't know how to address him. One Sharaban, Merc. He wheeled away back into the darkness. Sharaban? I weakly repeated as I watched him leave. The dominant level 2 group. They were assigned to this hunt. I asked the 2 sentries. All level 2s were assigned. It happens once a year. How did you elude them? The younger sentry was violating all protocol and rank distinction with the question. That's enough. 6. The other sentry snapped. You heard one Sharaban, Merc. Get back to your section. He pushed me in the direction of the gate. As I walked among the buildings just beginning to come alive with dawn activity, I tried to piece together what had happened. The gruff voice was the leader of the Sharaban, which meant he was the leader of male levels 1 and 2. Small wonder he was not pleased with me. The failure of a Bamaran elite cadre to capture all the Mercs would not polish their reputation, and it certainly wouldn't help one Sharaban's quest for the ultimate leadership position in level 3. While I understood that I would have to watch my step with one Sharaban, I also acknowledged that I had never been in a manlier or more attractive presence. It was like encountering an ideal that I'd only dreamed about. As I walked back to my section and accepted the congratulations of my mates, I was baffled not so much by the appearance of this new and commanding person in my life as by my recognition of his strong connection to me. But what connection? Did it have anything to do with the vision I'd had the first day in the pit with Calyx? From that point on, no one at Bamaran ever captured me again. And it was not for lack of trying. I became a bit of a legend. Other students constantly asked me about my evasive techniques. When I wasn't forthcoming, they grudgingly agreed that giving up this information would make me vulnerable in future hunts. I maintained, with a certain amount of truth, that with docents like Calyx such information was accessible to all Bamaran students. Of course I couldn't tell them the truth. How could I? Then I would have to tell them about my pets were strictly forbidden, and anyone caught with one was punished, and the pet destroyed. How could they accept that Mila taught me the lessons that had enabled me to crawl out of the wilderness undetected? Contains menu with 0 items. Book content text. And how do you explain those lessons? I struggled to explain them to myself, cultivating stillness and silence, relying less on sight, sound, and physical touch and developing the finer senses to gather intelligence. So much of what we see and hear is not the truth of any given situation. Sometimes it's necessary to close the eyes and be still, to extend our awareness beyond what we've been conditioned to believe is our field of sensory operation. Only then can we learn the patience to trust that all the information that we need will come to us. This is some of the wisdom of the Retner. The wisdom that helped me hold my place for the first time. And for better or worse, it was this wisdom that set the unexpected course of my life. Book content text. 11 entry : The other day, the doctor, Odo, and I were at the Reclamat having lunch, an event that Odo, after our conversation, had taken it upon himself to organize. The station grows more tense each day the invasion is put off. The fabric of community interaction is wearing thin, and flaring tempers are no longer confined to quirks. Indeed, after my situation, the promenade witnessed several such incidents. Each day we look for signs that might indicate who will be assigned where, for what duty, and when. Each day we're disappointed, and the tension is further bloated with rumors that range from the plausible to the wildly fantastic. As the casualty figures mount, some of us attempt to keep the prevailing sense of doom at arm's length with what the doctor calls gallows humor. The one I heard this morning was about you, Garak. It was clear from Odo's expression that he'd been looking forward to this moment. I was warned that not only were you a changeling, but that the reason you spent so much time in the Reclamat was that you had found a way to slowly poison us all. I am sure the Reclamat is quite capable of doing that without my help. I was only half joking. That must be the same person who came to me and accused you of sewing the deadly toxin into his shirt, the doctor said. Yes, I remember him. He didn't want to pay for the shirt. And I did remember him, another Bajoran who thought he could alleviate his troubles by targeting the Cardassian tailor. When I did an analysis of the shirt, the doctor went on, I found nothing but traces of his own bodily fluids. Which were toxic only to the people in his immediate presence. I added just before a fight broke out in the food line. Two Romulans had decided that waiting in line was beneath their dignity, and the others were vigorously disagreeing. Odo did not appreciate the interruption and gave our new allies a blunt lesson in station etiquette. They left with sneering disdain. With friends like that. Odo sat down and gave me a look. It was Captain Sisko's idea to get the Romulans involved. Odo. Not mine, I answered. The look. Humph, was his only reply. But what about you, Doctor? I asked, returning to the business at hand. It seems there's a movement afoot to have you replace Captain Sisko. The doctor winced. Is this true? Odo asked. We both looked to the doctor for confirmation. He sighed. There's a group of genetically enhanced people who feel that one of their own should be guiding the station during this emergency, and they've petitioned the Federation Council, but it's Jack and his group, and no one takes them. Exasperated, he broke off. Garak, how did you hear about this? My clientele talk and I listened. This was also true. An idiot savant who wears his presumed genetic superiority like a badge of privilege walked into my shop and never stopped talking. Of course I encouraged him, and by the time he left I had heard all about some organized attempt to elevate Dr. Bashir to the leadership position. I could see that the doctor was upset that I'd divulged this information. Clearly this genetic business was not his favorite topic of conversation. Is this something we should keep an eye on? Odo asked, studying us carefully. No, not at all, the doctor assured him. It's just Jack's people. This was nearly a year ago, and I'm afraid they have too much time on their hands like some other people I know. He, book content text, pointedly looked away from me as Odo continued to study us, trying to decode the undercurrent of this last exchange between us. No wonder he was such a capable security operative. Odo registered every change in tone and temperature and tracked the change down to its cause. Tell me something, Garak. It was clear that he had found an opening for one of those deferred questions he kept on a prioritized list somewhere in his changeling head. He was still a basically shy and tactful person, especially when it came to other people's business, but lately he'd become more openly inquisitive. I wondered if it was Major Kira's influence. Certainly, Constable, I replied. If Cardassian remains within the Dominion sphere, would you stay on the station? Judging from the sartorial styles, I gestured to the crowded room, I'd say a good tailor is a necessity. I smiled, not believing for a moment that I'd survive an aborted invasion of Cardassia or that there would still be a Deep Space Nine if we failed. This must be the lunch where we deal with uncomfortable subjects. But if Cardosia is liberated from Dominion control, Odo went on. When Cardosia is liberated, I interrupted. Would you return? Would you return to the Great Link? Odo reacted with sharp annoyance to the question. It wasn't a fair one, because although we were both exiles, we were in very different circumstances. With the humanoid shape he was still learning to live with, and his deepening relationship with Major Kira, Odo was discovering a new mode of existence, the New Link. He had an alternative, however difficult the choice. I did and yes, I know. You can't say. I was sorry I had asked again. It was a question he was obviously struggling with. Would you return to the same Cardosia? The doctor asked. What do you mean same? But I knew perfectly well what he meant. To a Cardosia containing the political and social elements that made the current situation possible. My dear doctor, that's also the Cardosia that made me possible. I half hoped my joke would end this conversation. But I knew better. Yes, certainly, but given its totalitarian bent, do you really believe that the previous regime served its people? Liberation might allow for a new government that would ensure the freedom and well-being of its citizens, one that was based upon democratic principles. I made no reply. We've had our clashes on the subject of Earth-style democracy during previous lunches. Dr. Bashir was of the opinion that the Cardosian political system allowed too many competing groups, especially the military central command and the Obsidian Order, to function in secret and above the will of the people. No one was surprised when the Detapa Council, the ruling civilian authority, overthrew the central command, and very few people, certainly, mourned the demise of the Obsidian Order. But while I didn't disagree entirely with the doctor's analysis, I found it somewhat simplistic. One cannot understand a political system detached from its societal context. I also found his eagerness to promote these political remedies somewhat condescending, but I knew the good doctor was on a mission, and I was determined to show good manners and let him make his case. With your background and experience, Barak, I'm certain that you could serve as a liaison between a new Cardosian government and the Federation. The doctor paused and waited for a response. None was forthcoming. I once suggested that you visit Earth as a member of the Cardosian government in exile. Laughter erupted from my mouth. I truly couldn't stop it. Forgive me, doctor, but the people who call themselves our government in exile wouldn't have me to lunch and I wouldn't let them clean my shoes. Book content text. But you see, the doctor exclaimed, that's just the problem. Each group has its own agenda. You're all so busy finding reasons to dislike each other that you don't have the will or the energy to find common ground. You're so dedicated to your reptilian mindset, I prompted. Well. Yes. I laughed again, but inside I was beginning to lose patience with the analysis. You are, Barak. Democratic principles, on the other hand, are about adjusting boundaries, negotiating these differences, finding some kind of consensus. Your common ground. No one could accuse me of not listening, especially to the key phrases. Yes. Because without common ground there's nothing left except the kind of selfish interest that eventually leads to anarchy. Don't you see? That's why the Dominion found Cardosia to be easy pickings. I looked over at Odo. He was nodding in appreciative agreement, as if he'd learned something new and interesting. Indeed, there were several people at adjoining tables who were hanging on to the doctor's passionate words, as if he'd been anointed not just leader of the station but the savior of the Alpha Quadrant. Of course they loved his analysis of the evil Cardosian Empire. That's why I urge you to go to Earth and experience, firsthand, a democracy that has evolved and united so many disparate groups. I had had enough. First of all, doctor, I don't quite know what you mean by democratic principles. Are you referring to the appalling lack of discipline and self-control I've observed on this station? The exaltation of individual freedom above the welfare of the group? The fact that the first among equals in democratic society seem to get preference and privilege? Go back to Cardosia. Someone shouted from a table. Dominion spite. Cried another. That's enough, commanded Odo. He wasn't going to let this get out of control. That's another principle, is it not, doctor? I gestured to the crowd. Free expression of one's opinion? Yes, it is. Barak. Educate me, doctor, please. I'm obviously in the dark about these principles. What about the shabby manner in which certain acts of public service are ignored because they don't measure up to ethical Federation standards? Is that also a principle? Whereas lying, cheating, and stealing seem to be encouraged and amply rewarded as long as they keep the wheels of commerce turning and bring in a profit. You see, my friend, I'm somewhat confused. One man's democratic principle seems to be another man's political and social nightmare! My voice had risen to an uncharacteristic pitch. It was still ringing in my ears as the doctor stared at me as if he were studying a baffling microbe. I, too, was baffled. I had no idea where this outburst came from. I know that a distance has widened between us during the past year or so, and I know that the Holosuite program incident and the revelations of his genetic enhancement are the symptoms of this distance rather than the cause. It's only natural we're very different people. I also know that he had only the best intentions in suggesting that I use the Federation model in order to influence the future of Cartersite. Misguided, yes, and somewhat patronizing and arrogant, but hardly sufficient to elicit this embarrassing and public loss of control. I mumbled some sad excuse which the good doctor and Odo were kind enough not to challenge and left the reclamant to return to my shop. As I passed Quartz I caught his eye and we nodded. Why I included him in my outburst also puzzled me. I rather admire his industry and resourcefulness. I especially admire the way he consistently bends Federation rules so that they work for him. Book content text. Back in the shop I shut the doors and tried to work on an outfit I had started to cut and to come up with some designs for Odo. That brown uniform of his is so drab. I was pleased when he decided to take my advice about something more stylish. What is going on with me? Surely it's not about Captain Sisko ignoring my contribution to the Romulan solution. I know better. The reward for work well done is the work itself. I've been included in the invasion of Cartersite space, regardless of how limited its ambition and scope or when it takes place. The rest of it, recognition, medals, monuments, is truly not important to me. What is important is that I feel that I am necessary, that I function with all my faculties in the service of a greater cause. And while I wait for this invasion, is making Odo more attractive to Major Kira the greater cause? I threw down my sketches. I didn't want to stay in the shop with these colliding thoughts. But as I was about to leave, I was stopped in my tracks. I knew what it was, Odo's question. What will I do if Cartersite remained in Dominion control? Where would I go? The doctor's interruption prevented me from answering, but truly I have no answer. I don't know where I'd go. Much more troubling to me, however, is another question. Will I have a home if Cartersite is liberated? Book content text. 12 entry : As I progress through my first level at Bamaran, I acquired the reputation as a resourceful and serious student. Not only had I broken all previous records for evasion of capture in the wilderness, but I had also excelled in my studies. The only member of my group who performed as well in all areas was the taciturn 8. I had no real friends to speak of, and told myself that loneliness was the price I had to pay for success. I considered the games and behavior of my mates to be childish, and that any unnecessary interaction would only distract me from my work. The truth, of course, was that I didn't know how to forge those kinds of bonds. I wanted to be closer to 8, and to a lesser degree 5, who besides being one of the great pit strategists Bamaran ever had was fair in all his dealings. The rest, to one degree or another, I found to be jealous and manipulative. As I began to progress rapidly after my success in the wilderness, one and his allies obviously felt threatened and maneuvered as a unit to cut me out of the unity we were supposed to be creating as a group. They did the same to 8. Because this was directly counter to our training goals, they had to be clever and subtle about their methods. They had a harder time with 5, because he wasn't as aloof as 8 and we made their job easier for them. 8 with his silence and me with my lip. Inspired by my guide my lip, I would experiment at withdrawing my presence when I had to remain in the same room with people I didn't like. Of course I couldn't change my coloring like a Regner, but with constant practice I was learning to change the nexus of thought, feeling, and perception that defines my presence in space. If I am sitting on a rock, I surrender to the vibratory rate of that rock, using the techniques I began learning in the wilderness. The more successful I became, the more I was able to keep the others students at a comfortable distance, especially the ones so involved with their own agendas. They were not paying the attention they should have. When I smuggled Mila into my section, I made a home for him behind the shelving of my personal wall compartment. This compartment was the one place where a student's privacy was inviolable. No one was permitted to inspect these compartments, not even the upper-level leaders. Without this piece of privacy I would never have been able to keep Mila. I created a space for him consisting of elements from the wilderness, and I enjoyed opening the compartment and just watching him, especially when I was missing my home and family. One day I was stretched out on my bed after a grueling training exercise. A few of the other section mates were in the room and I didn't want to be included in their idiotic conversation, so I employed my disappearing technique. I was working on some calibrating equations from engineering class when I heard 3 exclaim, "10 has something in his compartment." 3 had that winning combination of arrogance and stupidity, and he spoke as if I were not in the room. Why else does she spend so much time staring inside? 3 demanded. The others in the room, 6 and 9, were also unaware of me, and conversation turned into an argument over whether or not 3 should inspect my compartment for illegal contraband. 6, to his credit, pulled his head out of his studies long enough to remind 3 that such a search was forbidden on any pretext. 3 sneered at 6's objection and reasoned, with the logic of a bully, that his search was in the service of the group and that our section leader would support the action. 9, another mental giant, agreed. 10 thinks he's smarter than anyone else. We'll see how smart he is. 3 never liked me, it's true, but his attitude stemmed more from the old belief that since his ridges were more developed than anyone else in the group he was entitled to lord it over us. His ideas of racial superiority, backed by his size and strength, made him quite dangerous. As 3 moved to my compartment I slipped deeper into my trance-like breathing, and my energy liquefied and became book content text. Part of the pallet cover I lay upon. Just as he was about to open my compartment, I returned to the room and sat up. His magnificent ridges nearly fell off. I can certainly understand if you want to borrow my mouth freshener, 3, but you need my permission. I jumped up, fully expecting the inevitable physical confrontation that was an integral part of our communal life. We were all constantly defining and redefining our boundaries. But 3 just looked at me, stared, really, as if he had seen the Mogarund itself, a phantasmal creature from Carter science myth that occasionally returns from the spirit world to correct the moral balance of our world. As children, we were warned that our bad behavior would guarantee a visit from the Mogarund. I looked from the pale, frozen face of 3 to the others. They all looked like statues commemorating fear. And I was pleased. I realized at that moment that they were in my control, and that I would no longer have any trouble with them. Especially 3. I felt the power like a drug surging through my system. I also felt the increased distance between us that their fear created. I accepted this shift in our boundaries. The increased isolation was a fair price to pay for my laws and my inviolability. We had gained greater freedom to enjoy each other's company. Book content text. 13 entry : After my success in the wilderness, I briefly encountered Palantine a few times after our initial meeting. The one time we could have spoken together again in the training area near the pit, I made an excuse and hurried off. That such meetings were against the rules was how I justified my abrupt behavior. As a level 2 student she should be more responsible. I didn't know what she wanted from me, but I found her presence threatening and disorienting. Docent Rilan gave me permission to do some research at the Archival Center on wormhole phenomena. First-level students were not allowed in the center without special dispensation, but I had proven myself a serious student, and became one of Rilan's favorites. When I entered my permission chip at the entrance, I was instructed by a disembodied voice: "Attend to your business in Section 3, Row 8, Monitor 5. You have 2 units of time." The door opened and I entered. I proceeded to my designated area and punched in my request for specific information as to the spatial conditions that alert us to wormhole activity. I prepared my recording chip for notes and settled in for a quiet and pleasurable investigation of one of my favorite subjects, the wormhole funnel that connects the here and now to seeming infinity. The mystery always fascinated me, and those people who dedicated their lives to its exploration were among my heroes. There was Doran Tyne, who had camped outside the Prime Moon wormhole in an old Gaylor-class shuttle and waited for the next turbulent opening. He believed that he had decoded the cyclical regularity and that the next opening would give him time to enter the wormhole, move through to the other side, do some exploration, perhaps collect some samples, and return before it closed. It was like saying that you could come back from death. Everyone thought he was on an insane suicide mission. They didn't believe he could succeed. And when he did and he reported his findings, the scientific community didn't want to believe him. His description of the journey thrills me even today. But when others tried to use his cyclical calculations and were lost, Kine was discredited. He eventually died in disgrace. I heard my name, and thought it was coming from the Martian wormhole I was studying. This time I turned around and there was Palandine, sitting next to me. You must be very special, if they let you in here, she said without irony. I looked around to see who else was in our row. There's nobody here. I waited until you were alone. Why are you avoiding me? The directness of the question stopped me. I didn't know how to respond. Did I insult you? You were positively rude to me the last time we met. I am not comfortable calling me a limb. Nobody does that. I struggled to explain. How much time do you have left? She asked. I looked at the screen. Less than half the unit. Come with me, she said as if it were a simple request. I can't. Why not? Who's the docent who gave you permission? She asked. Roland. Yes, she said with recognition. And of course you're serious enough to be his prize student. Now the irony was creeping into her tone. Whatever you have, it's going to be enough for your report. Come on, I want to show you something. I didn't know what to do. My body was twitching with discomfort. You're still not having fun, are you? Lim? No, I'm not. Especially with you bothering me. Will you leave me alone? And stop calling me a limb? I'm 10 Lubac.